In late June 530 AD, according to the Byzantine historian Procopius, a 25-year-old commander named Belisarius ordered his men to dig trenches, not straight lines, not simple barriers, a geometric trap of unprecedented complexity. A recessed center flanked by forward-projecting wings that would turn mathematics itself into a weapon. Before him stood 50,000 Persian warriors, double his numbers. Behind him, the fortress city of Dara, and the last hope of Rome's eastern frontier. Think about those numbers. 25,000 Byzantines against 50,000 Persians. A 2-to-1 disadvantage facing the heavy armored cavalry that had crushed armies from the Indus to the Euphrates. Contemporary sources on both sides confirm these figures. This wasn't propaganda. This was documented impossible odds. By the end of this video, you'll understand how Procopius's extraordinarily detailed account reveals tactical innovations that military academies still study today. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that changed warfare itself. First, the field fortification system that appears nowhere else in ancient military literature. Second, why a bathroom attendant's duels, recorded in meticulous detail by Procopius, shattered Persian psychological superiority. Third, the 3-second decision, documented in the primary source, that destroyed 5,000 of Persia's elite cavalry. But here's what makes this historically fascinating. How did trenches, static defenses, defeat the world's most mobile cavalry? Why did Persian commanders, who'd conquered half of Asia, charge directly into an obvious trap? How did a wind, documented by the chronicler, change the trajectory of 200,000 arrows? And why does Procopius provide tactical details so specific that modern archaeologists use them with satellite imagery to reconstruct the exact battlefield? To understand how geometry defeated an empire, we need to step back to the spring of 530 AD, when the throne of Persia looked west with hungry eyes. The year 526 saw the kind of miscalculation that births wars. King Kavad, the first of Persia, ruler of an empire stretching from the Hindu Kush to the Euphrates, made a decision that contemporary chronicles record as catastrophic. He attempted to force the Christian kingdom of Iberia, modern-day Georgia, to abandon their faith and adopt Zoroastrianism. The Iberian king Gorgon, faced with religious conversion at sword point, did what desperate Christian monarchs did in the 6th century. He appealed to Rome, not the Rome of Caesar and legions. That empire was dust. But to Constantinople, to the Eastern Roman Empire that still called itself Rome, that still remembered what those syllables meant. Emperor Justin I, and after 527, his nephew Justinian I, saw opportunity in Iberia's plea. Not just a chance to protect Christian allies, but to challenge Persian dominance in the Transcaucasus, to disrupt the silk and spice routes that made Persian middlemen wealthy beyond measure. This was the Iberian War, documented by both Procopius and the Syriac chronicler Zacharias Rhetor. Not merely territorial dispute, but clash of empires over religion, trade, and the realignment of client states. What made it dangerous was geography. Between the Byzantine heartland of Anatolia and the Persian capital at Ctesiphon lay Mesopotamia, that ancient cradle of civilization now serving as an eternal battlefield, where Rome and Persia had bled each other for centuries. And right there, barely 18 to 22 kilometers from the Persian stronghold of Nisibis, sat something that made Persian commanders furious every time they looked west. The fortress city of Dara. Emperor Anastasius I had built it between 491 and 518 AD, and Procopius describes it in loving architectural detail in his work buildings. 2.8 kilometers of walls, 18 meters high at the upper stories, walls 4 meters thick that could laugh at siege engines. A great cistern with 10 parallel chambers, each 50 meters long. That meant the city could withstand siege indefinitely. The Persians viewed Dara's very existence as a treaty violation. Too close to Nisibis, too strong, too obviously designed as a base for Roman offensive operations into Mesopotamia. They weren't wrong. Every stone in those walls proclaimed Byzantine intent to defend and eventually reclaim territories they'd lost. By 530, the strategic situation had deteriorated into a pattern Byzantine commanders knew well: defeat. Roman attempts to fortify other border positions at Thanouris and Melibasa had been countered by Persian preemptive strikes. A Roman offensive against Nisibis had accomplished exactly nothing. The frontier was fragmenting, the local principalities too busy fighting each other to mount coherent resistance. Contemporary sources paint a picture of an empire on the defensive, buying time with fortresses while trying to figure out how to survive against an enemy that seemed to be winning every engagement that mattered. The economic dimension added pressure. Byzantine attempts to bypass Persian control of the Silk Road through alliances with Yemen and the Aksumite Empire had yielded limited results. Persia still controlled the most profitable trade routes in the known world. But fortress walls, however massive, still needed defenders. And in 529, Justinian made a decision that would change everything. He promoted a 24-year-old officer of unremarkable birth to command the entire eastern frontier. Picture a young man, perhaps 24 years old, stepping into a command that would make or break empires. Flavius Belisarius. Even his birthplace is disputed by historians. Possibly Germania and Thrace, possibly Illyria, possibly elsewhere. The sources simply don't tell us. What they do tell us is more important. He wasn't from an aristocratic family. No inherited estates. No political connections. No family military tradition stretching back generations. Just ability. Pure, undeniable competence in an empire that desperately needed it. Procopius, who would chronicle his campaigns in extraordinary detail, provides only fragments of Belisarius's early life. We know he served in the Busalari, those personal guard units that generals maintained at their own expense. We know he rose through merit in a system where merit often meant less than bloodline. And we know that when Justinian divided the command structure of the eastern frontier and needed someone to hold the critical Mesopotamian sector, he chose this young officer whose name would echo through military history. The appointment as Magister Militum per Orientem, Master of Soldiers of the East, came with shared command. Hermogenes, the Magister Officiorum, would provide political oversight and handle diplomatic negotiations. But Procopius makes clear throughout his account that when it came to tactical decisions, to the actual direction of battle, Belisarius held the reins, 24 years old, first major independent command, facing an empire. What made Justinian trust him? Procopius describes Belisarius throughout his wars as methodical, not impulsive. Quote 0, he writes, despite Belisarius's youth. Humane and gentle to all, which might seem strange praise for a general until you consider that in an era of brutal commanders, humanity could be its own tactical advantage. Troops who believed their general cared about their lives fought with different intensity than those who knew they were expendable. The Busalari Belisarius, built around himself, represented his military philosophy made flesh. These weren't typical Byzantine cavalry. He paid for them personally, equipped them personally, and trained them in a revolutionary doctrine. dual-purpose warfare. Most cavalry of the era specialized. You were either heavy cavalry with lance and armor for shock charges, or light cavalry with bow for skirmishing and harassment. Belisarius's Bucellari mastered both. They could loose arrows from horseback with Hunnish precision, then close with lance and sword for decisive shock action. This flexibility would prove critical at Dara. The ability to adapt, to respond to changing tactical situations without committing to a single approach, represented a sophistication beyond most generals twice his age. But sophisticated tactics mean nothing without the nerve to employ them under pressure. Belisarius possessed something Procopius emphasizes repeatedly: calm under pressure. Not the false calm of inexperience, but the genuine calm of a man who had thought through every contingency, planned for every disaster, and trusted his preparation. He would need that calm, because waiting for him in the desert approaches to Dara was the finest military machine the ancient world had ever assembled. An army that had conquered from Korea to the gates of Constantinople. 50,000 warriors who had never known defeat in open battle. And commanding them, a Persian general whose arrogance would prove to be Belisarius's greatest ally. What the Persians didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that this young commander saw warfare differently than any general they'd faced. He saw terrain as a weapon, psychology as artillery, and mathematics as destiny that could be rewritten if you were clever enough, ruthless enough, and calm enough to execute perfection when the moment arrived. Against Belisarius's 25,000, King Kavad I sent his Miran, his supreme commander, with the kind of force that made cities surrender without siege. Perazes. The name appears in Procopius's account without the biographical detail we might wish for. Persian sources from this period have largely vanished into history's gaps, lost to time and the chaos of later centuries. What we know of Perazes comes filtered through Byzantine chroniclers and the evidence of his decisions. His title alone tells us something. Miran, Supreme Commander, possibly also holding the rank of Spabed, Military Chief. These weren't titles given to incompetents or political appointees. Persian military culture was ruthlessly meritocratic at the command level. If you led 50,000 of the Shah's finest warriors, you'd earned that command through blood and victory. The numbers Procopius records are explicit and damning. 40,000 warriors marching from their camps toward Dara. Then, before the main engagement, 10,000 reinforcements from Nisibis itself. 50,000 total. A 2-to-1 advantage that should have guaranteed victory by every principle of ancient warfare. The composition of that force represented the evolution of Persian military doctrine over centuries. At its core rode the Savaran, aristocratic heavy cavalry that combined the shock power of armored horsemen with the missile capability of composite bow archers. Both rider and horse protected by lamellar or scale armor. Long lances for the charge, bows for sustained fire, swords for close combat. Warriors trained from childhood, not just in fighting, but in the arts of war as philosophy and profession. Among them rode forces that historians identify as the legendary Jayadan, the immortals. Procopius doesn't use that term in his Dara account. He writes instead of, quote, 2 of elite forces commanded by generals named Pityaxes and Barismanas. But the description matches what other sources tell us about the 10,000-strong bodyguard unit that represented the pinnacle of Persian military excellence. Some, according to Persian military equipment documented from this period, wore metal face masks that created an unfeeling, robotic appearance. Psychological warfare designed to make them seem less than human, more than mortal. These weren't soldiers. They were the warrior aristocracy of an empire that had perfected the art of war through 5 centuries of continuous campaigning. But every military machine has weak points, and Procopius records Belisarius identifying Persia's with cutting precision. The infantry. The peasant levies with minimal training and equipment so poor it bordered on criminal. Wicker shields, spears, almost no armor. Their role was to provide mass to the formation, to hold ground, to perform labor during sieges, not to fight. Procopius preserves what may be Belisarius's actual assessment of them. Giving these men spears no more made them spearmen than giving them flutes would make them snake charmers. This wasn't merely insult. It was tactical analysis. The Persian military doctrine depended almost entirely on their cavalry. The infantry existed to be expendable, to die in place so the cavalry could maneuver. Against an opponent who understood this, who could exploit the gap between Persian cavalry excellence and infantry worthlessness. That doctrine became a vulnerability. The Persian command structure matched their battlefield deployment. Persius himself would take the center with the cream of his forces. The right wing fell to Pityaxes, the left to Borismanes, who commanded what historians identify as the immortal contingent. The Jayadan would be held in reserve initially, the ultimate weapon to be committed when and where decisive breakthrough seemed possible. All of this was standard, professional. The accumulated wisdom of an empire that had been waging sophisticated warfare since before Rome was founded. The Persians approached Dara with the confidence of an army that had never lost when it held numerical superiority. Their doctrine was proven. Their equipment was superior. Their training was rigorous. And Persius himself displayed the arrogance of a man who commanded overwhelming force. Procopius records a message that the Persian commander sent to Belisarius before battle. Not a formal declaration, not diplomatic courtesy, a threat dripping with contempt. "Have lunch and a bath ready," Persius told the young Byzantine general. He would be dining in Dara the following day, after he'd taken the city and captured Belisarius himself. That message would become one of history's most poorly aged boasts. But in the moment, who could blame Persius's confidence? He commanded 50,000 of the finest warriors the ancient world had produced. He faced a 25-year-old in his first major command. He had the numbers. He had the experience. He had the reputation of an empire that hadn't lost a major engagement in this theater for years. What he didn't command was caution, and that would cost him everything. Here's what made historians call this impossible. Belisarius didn't just prepare for battle. He rewrote the rules of geometry to create a weapon that had never existed in warfare. Field fortifications weren't new. Armies had been digging defensive works since bronze gave way to iron. Roman legions were legendary for their entrenching discipline. Every camp a miniature fortress, every position prepared for defense. What Belisarius designed at Dara was something else entirely. Something so sophisticated that when Procopius described it in his History of the Wars, he provided the only detailed account of such a system in ancient military literature. Not straight trenches running parallel to the enemy approach. Not a simple ditch and rampart combination to slow an assault. Geometric precision married to tactical psychology in a design that modern military analysts still study. The system began with a recessed center. The short central segment of trench pulled back toward Dara's walls, creating a pocket that looked vulnerable, that seemed to invite attack. From the ends of this central segment, cross trenches extended forward at right angles, not toward the city, but toward the approaching enemy. And at the tips of these forward extensions, the trenches turned again and ran parallel to the center line for considerable distance. effectively covering the Byzantine flanks. The overall shape resembled an inverted T or a recessed U. But Procopius's description reveals something more subtle. At regular intervals along these trenches, Belisarius left earthen bridges, solid ground where his own cavalry could cross to launch counterattacks. The Persians, seeing trenches blocking their approach, would have to navigate these obstacles, while Byzantine horsemen could move freely across their own fortifications. Procopius doesn't record how long Belisarius had to prepare these works. Days, probably. The Byzantine army of 25,000 would have needed every man laboring to excavate earthworks of this complexity. Modern archaeologist Christopher Lillington Martin, using satellite imagery combined with Procopius's text, confirmed the feasibility of this system within the actual topography of the Dara battlefield. The strategic intent behind this geometry was threefold. Though Procopius focuses more on describing the physical structure than explaining the theory, military historians analyzing his account recognize the sophistication of what Belisarius created. First, neutralization of numbers. The recessed center meant that if Persians massed their 50,000 warriors against that vulnerable-looking position, they would expose their flanks to enfilading fire from Byzantine cavalry positioned on the wings. The trenches channeled Persian attacks into corridors where numerical superiority meant nothing. You could only fit so many men into a narrow approach, regardless of how many thousands waited behind them. Second, psychological funneling. The recessed center invited attack on the Byzantine wings, where Belisarius had prepared his ambushes. It played to Persian expectations, hit the flanks, roll them up, crush the center. Standard cavalry doctrine. Except the flanks weren't weak. They were traps. Third, interior lines. The space behind the central trench allowed Belisarius to move his reserves from one wing to another without obstruction, without crossing his own front lines. He could mass at the point of decision faster than the Persians could adjust their distributed forces. In military theory, this is called operating on interior lines. Belisarius was doing it 15 centuries before the theory was formally codified. But tactical theory only matters if geography cooperates. And here, the location of Dara itself became part of the weapon. The approach to the city funneled through what modern archaeologists call the Gap of Dara, a narrowing of the river valley between hills that prevented the Persians from deploying their full width. They couldn't bring 50,000 men to bear simultaneously. The gap, combined with Belisarius's trenches, meant perhaps 5,000 to 8,000 could engage at any given point. Suddenly, 2-to-1 odds became something closer to even, or even favored the defenders. Procopius provides these details with a precision that suggests either first-hand observation or access to detailed military reports. The fact that his description allowed modern researchers using satellite technology to identify the probable battlefield location speaks to the accuracy of his account. This wasn't literary invention. This was documentation of something unprecedented. Survey of ancient military literature confirms the uniqueness of this system. Other generals dug trenches. Belisarius turned them into geometric certainty, a mathematical proof written in earth and blood that would demonstrate a fundamental principle. When you can't match your enemy's numbers, you change the battlefield until numbers don't matter. The trenches were dug. The geometry was perfect. But Belisarius needed one more weapon, one that would make 50,000 men doubt their eyes. He needed theater, and a bathroom attendant was about to deliver it. Day one began not with armies clashing, but with a single horseman riding to the Byzantine lines with a challenge older than war itself. Procopius records the sequence with the attention to detail that makes his account invaluable. The Persian vanguard, 500 picked riders, entered the marsh paths just after first light. They moved in standard formation, scouts ahead, main body following, flankers pushing through what trees the geography allowed. Professional, careful, alert. A brief cavalry skirmish erupted on the Byzantine left. Roman cavalry engaged, killed 7 Persians according to Procopius's count, then withdrew to their lines. Belisarius, watching from his central position, used this not as victory but as intelligence, gauging Persian reaction time, observing their tactical discipline, measuring their aggressiveness. Then the theater began. A young Persian horseman, armored and confident, rode up to the Roman lines and issued a challenge. Single combat. Any Byzantine warrior brave enough to face him. This was tradition, psychological warfare dressed as honor. The Persians expected either acceptance, in which case their champion would likely kill his opponent and demoralize the Byzantines, or refusal, which would paint the defenders as cowards. What they got was Andreas. Procopius identifies him with precision that suggests historical accuracy rather than literary invention. A Balneus, a bath attendant. Not even a soldier in the formal sense, but a man who worked in the military bathhouse and served as a wrestling trainer. He'd been secretly practicing with the Bucellari, Procopius notes, teaching them grappling techniques and learning horseback combat in return. When the Persian challenge rang out, Andreas requested permission to accept. Belisarius refused. This wasn't false modesty. Andreas literally wasn't a professional warrior. Sending him would be sending a civilian against a trained cavalry champion. But Andreas appealed, and something in the young general's calculation shifted. Maybe he saw opportunity. Maybe he recognized that unconventional situations demanded unconventional responses. Belisarius agreed. What happened next? Procopius records in detail that historians note may contain some dramatic embellishment typical of ancient battle narratives, though the core facts remain consistent. Andreas charged the Persian champion. His spear, and here the account becomes specific in a way that suggests eyewitness reports, struck the Persian's breast. The champion was unhorsed. Andreas dismounted and finished him on the ground. The impact on both armies was immediate and profound. For the Persians, warriors who viewed themselves as a superior caste bred for war, being defeated by a Roman bath attendant was a humiliation that cut deeper than mere military loss. For the Byzantines, many of whom were inexperienced frontier troops who feared the legendary Persian heavy cavalry, watching their champions fall to a man who cleaned other men's sweat for a living provided a psychological boost that Procopius emphasizes as critical to what followed. But Andreas wasn't finished. A second Persian champion rode out, presumably to restore honor and reverse the psychological damage. Andreas immediately rode out again. Procopius notes he didn't even wait for permission this time. The second duel ended like the first. Persian champion unhorsed. Persian champion killed. 2 champions, 2 victories. A bathroom attendant. The Persian army, 40,000 strong with 10,000 more coming, had watched their warrior elite bested by a Roman civilian. Twice. The mythology of Persian invincibility, the psychological edge they carried into every engagement, began to crack. After the second duel, combat ceased for the day. What followed was diplomacy, or the appearance of it. Belisarius sent a letter to Perozes. Procopius preserves what may be the actual content, or at least the theme. Quote _3. Perozes' reply dripped with the contempt of a man commanding overwhelming force. Have your lunch and bath ready, the Persian commander told Belisarius. He would be dining in Dara the following day as the conqueror. That night, as both armies tried to sleep, knowing dawn would bring something decisive, 10,000 Persian reinforcements arrived from Nisibis. Perazes now commanded exactly 50,000 warriors. The 2-to-1 advantage was complete. Across the battlefield, men on both sides prepared for what they knew would come. The Persians with the confidence of superior numbers and proven doctrine. The Byzantines with geometric certainty written in trenches and the improbable confidence that came from watching impossible things become real. 2 Bath slave victories over Persian champions. Not strategy, not tactics. Theater. Psychological warfare that made grown men question what they thought they knew about Persian superiority. Procopius's account is remarkably detailed, perhaps suspiciously so for events he may not have personally witnessed. While the core facts are consistent, a Bath attendant named Andreas defeated 2 Persian champions in succession. The precise combat details may contain some dramatic embellishment typical of ancient military narratives. What matters is that both armies believed it happened, and belief shaped what came next. As the sun set on that first day, 2 Persian champions lay dead. 10,000 fresh Persian warriors arrived in darkness. And across the battlefield, men on both sides tried to sleep knowing that dawn would bring something neither side had ever seen. A battle where mathematics itself would become a weapon. Dawn broke on late June 530 over a battlefield that geography had designed for slaughter, if you knew how to read it. The approach to Dara funneled through what modern archaeologist Christopher Lillington Martin, using satellite imagery combined with Procopius's descriptions, identifies as the Gap of Dara, a narrow river valley flanked by hills. Not dramatic mountains, but elevated ground sufficient to constrain deployment, to prevent the kind of sweeping maneuvers that cavalry armies preferred. The Cords River ran through the city itself, its banks regularized with stone embankments and protected by heavily fortified water gates fitted with iron grills. 3 hills dominated the city's interior, providing elevated positions for Byzantine observers and supporting archery fire. These weren't just defensive features. They were tactical assets that extended the effective range of Byzantine eyes and arrows beyond what the Persians could easily suppress. Procopius records the Byzantine deployment with the precision of a man describing a tactical masterpiece. The infantry occupied the center position, behind the recessed segment of the trench system. They weren't expected to fight decisively. Their role was to hold ground, to serve as an anvil while cavalry hammered. The wings were where Belisarius expected decision. On the left, Bauses commanded the cavalry. On the right, John the Armenian. Both were experienced officers, professionals who understood that their initial role would be defensive, absorb the Persian assault, hold long enough for the plan to work, then counterattack when opportunity emerged. At the angles of the trench system, where the forward extensions turned to run parallel to the center, 1,200 Hun cavalry under 2 commanders, Sunicus and Igon, waited in position. These weren't Byzantine troops in the formal sense. They were federates, Hun horse archers recruited from the Eurasian steppes, men whose grandfathers had terrorized Rome and who now fought for Roman gold. Peerless light cavalry whose composite bows and hit-and-run tactics had evolved over centuries of warfare on the endless grasslands. Behind the northern hill, completely concealed from the Persian approach, 300 Heruli cavalry under their commander Faras had taken position before the Persian vanguard even arrived. Germanic warriors, fierce and loyal, positioned for an ambush that depended entirely on the Persians not scouting thoroughly enough, not expecting resistance from a direction they'd already passed. And in the center, maintaining the position that would allow him to observe both wings and commit reserves wherever the crisis emerged. Belisarius waited with his butsalari. The interior line's position, the fulcrum around which the entire battle would pivot. The Persian deployment was textbook doctrine. Procopius describes two deep lines. Mass and depth combined to create crushing pressure. Persius himself took the center with the best troops available for immediate commitment. The elite cavalry forces that historians identify as the immortals were held in reserve. The ultimate weapon to be employed when breakthrough seemed possible or crisis demanded. The right wing fell to Pityaxes, the left to Barismanes, who would command the immortals when they were finally committed to battle. Standard formation, professional. The accumulated wisdom of an empire that had been waging war successfully for centuries. The Persians initially positioned themselves approximately 20 stades from Dara. Procopius gives us this measurement. Roughly 3.7 kilometers or 2.3 miles. Close enough to be imposing, far enough to deploy properly. As the morning progressed, they advanced closer, tightening the distance, building psychological pressure. The timing Procopius records is specific. The battle began when the sun was already well up, midday or shortly after. The summer sun at its zenith over Mesopotamia meant heat that would become a factor in exhaustion. Though Procopius doesn't dwell on climatic details beyond what affected the fighting directly. What he does record, with emphasis that suggests he recognized its importance, was the wind. A strong, steady wind began blowing from the Byzantine position toward the Persians. Not a gust, not variable, a sustained environmental factor that would prove critical in the opening phase of battle. Picture the battlefield as Belisarius saw it from his central position. Ahead, the recessed center of his trench line, seemingly vulnerable. To left and right, his cavalry wings positioned behind forward-projecting trenches that would channel any assault. Behind the northern hill, invisible to Persian scouts, 300 Heruli waiting with the patience of hunters. At the angles, 1,200 Huns ready to strike flanks. In the city behind, 18-meter walls and supporting archers. And approaching across the gap, 50,000 Persian warriors arrayed in lines so deep they seemed to go on forever. The finest heavy cavalry the ancient world had ever produced. Infantry in such numbers they could afford to be expendable. Commanders who had never known defeat. The armies stood ready. The trenches waited like geometric teeth. The wind rose. And at midday, when the summer sun reached its zenith, the first arrows rose like a black cloud against the sky. The sound began like distant thunder. Then it became the world tearing apart. Procopius describes the opening of the main engagement with a phrase that has become famous among military historians. A vast cloud of arrows from both sides. Not metaphor, not exaggeration. The literal darkening of the sky as tens of thousands of shafts arced upward simultaneously. The Persians held the numerical advantage in this exchange, and it should have been decisive. More archers, more arrows. The ability to rotate fresh shooters forward while exhausted men rested. Professional composite bow users whose weapons were products of centuries of refinement. Multiple layers of horn, wood, and sinew that generated draw weights capable of punching through most armor at effective range. Standard doctrine said the side with more archers won the arrow duel. Standard doctrine said the Byzantines should have been suppressed, pinned, broken by sustained fire before the Persian cavalry even charged. Standard doctrine was about to discover that sometimes nature has its own ideas about who deserves to win. Procopius records what happened next, with the precision of a man who recognized he was documenting something unusual. That strong, steady wind blowing from the Byzantine position toward the Persians, the one he'd noted earlier, began to affect the arrow trajectories in ways that multiplied the Byzantine advantage and negated Persian superiority. Persian arrows, loosed into a headwind, had their momentum checked. The wind reduced their effective range, caused many to fall short of their targets, decreased the kinetic energy they carried on impact. Arrows that should have punched through armor instead struck with reduced force. Volleys that should have devastated Byzantine formations instead clattered against shields and ground with diminished effect. Byzantine arrows, carried by a tailwind, flew farther and struck harder. Wind that checked Persian shafts accelerated Byzantine ones. The same atmospheric conditions that handicapped one side empowered the other. But atmospheric advantage alone wouldn't have been sufficient if the Byzantine defenders hadn't prepared for exactly this kind of exchange. Their shields, and here Procopius focuses on the result rather than the technique. But military historians analyzing period equipment can reconstruct the methods. Were angled precisely to shed arrows, iron-banded wood construction, overlapping shield wall technique that Byzantine military practice had refined over centuries. Arrows designed to penetrate leather and light mail instead struck angled wooden surfaces at deflecting angles. Procopius notes that many Persian arrows penetrated Byzantine shields 2 or even 3 inches, testament to the power of Persian composite bows. Even into a headwind, but 2 or 3 inches into wood and iron, even carried through to strike the defender behind, wasn't enough to wound through the heavy furs and padding Byzantine soldiers wore in layers beneath their mail. The outcome, as Procopius assesses it, defied the mathematics of archery warfare. Despite having fewer archers, despite facing an enemy with superior shooting positions and unlimited ammunition, the Byzantines did not have the worst of this exchange. Military historians reading that phrase recognize it as Procopius's careful way of saying the Byzantines actually held their own, or better, in a duel they should have lost decisively. How long did this exchange last? Procopius doesn't specify duration in hours or even in clear time markers. Long enough to become clear that neither side would break from archery alone. Long enough for the Persians to rotate fresh shooters forward. Long enough for both armies to expend thousands upon thousands of arrows. But not so long that exhaustion or ammunition depletion forced a decision. The psychological impact cut both directions. For the Persians, who expected their arrow storm to break Byzantine morale before the real fighting began, the failure of this opening gambit eroded confidence. Their proven tactic, their reliable advantage, had been negated by wind and shields and Byzantine stubbornness. For the Byzantines, surviving what should have been annihilating fire proved that the impossible odds weren't quite as impossible as pure arithmetic suggested. But arrows alone wouldn't take Dara. Persian, watching from the Persian center as his archery advantage evaporated into inconclusive exchange, faced the decision that would define the battle. Withdraw and admit that 25,000 Byzantines could stand against 50,000 Persians. Unthinkable. The reputation of the Persian military machine, the psychological dominance that made cities surrender without siege, depended on the inevitability of Persian victory when they held numerical superiority. Pride, arrogance, and the crushing weight of reputation made the decision. The Persians would commit their cavalry to break what arrows couldn't. They would demonstrate why heavy armored horsemen at full gallop had been the decisive weapon of warfare for centuries. The arrow storm had failed, the Byzantine line stood unbroken, and Persian, watching from the center, gave the orders that would send thousands of his finest cavalry charging into traps they didn't know existed, toward an outcome that would shatter everything they believed about the inevitability of their own superiority. The first Persian cavalry charge came from their right wing under Pityaxes. Thousands of armored horsemen spurring toward the Byzantine left at full gallop. Procopius records that these picked riders forced their way across the trenches despite the obstacles. Not easily, not without cost, but with the determination of professional cavalry executing standard doctrine. Hit the wing, roll it up, crush the center from the flank. The kind of maneuver that had won battles from the Hindu Kush to the shores of the Mediterranean. They struck Buzes' cavalry position with the force of iron meeting iron. Initially, the mathematics seemed to be working. The Persians pushed the Byzantine left back. Buzes' men gave ground, fighting but withdrawing, the kind of defensive retreat that looks like the beginning of collapse. The Persian right wing pursued, driving deeper, sensing victory in the yielding of enemy formations. This was exactly what Belisarius had designed the recessed center to encourage. The Persians were doing what he'd predicted they would do, what he'd built his entire defensive system to exploit. They were advancing past the northern hill. Behind that hill, Pharas and his 300 Heruli had been waiting since before the battle began. Waiting with the discipline of men who understood that premature revelation would waste the only advantage surprise could provide. They'd listened to the arrow storm. They'd heard the thunder of Persian cavalry charging. And now, as Pityaxis' right wing pushed past their concealed position, they struck. 300 Germanic cavalry erupting from concealment, attacking from the rear. From a direction the Persians hadn't scouted, hadn't defended, hadn't even considered as a threat vector because they'd already passed that ground on their approach. Procopius describes the impact with the economy of a man recording fact. The Heruli struck the Persian right in the rear, creating complete tactical surprise. But Pharas' ambush was only the first hammer. At almost the same moment, the 1,200 Hun cavalry under Sunicus and Aigan counterattacked from their positions at the angles of the trench system. 600 Huns, half the force, struck the Persian right flank as it crossed the trenches. Light horse archers deadly at close range. Composite bows and curved swords wielded by men whose ancestors had terrorized civilized armies for generations. The Persians found themselves under attack from 3 directions. From the rear, Pharas' 300 Heruli. From the flank, 600 Huns. And from the front, as Buzes rallied his cavalry and countercharged back toward the enemy who'd been pushing him moments before. Trapped. The trenches that the Persians had just crossed now prevented lateral escape. The earthworks that had seemed like simple obstacles became walls of a killing pocket. Persian cavalry, committed to pursuit and caught in terrain that negated their mobility advantage, died in numbers that Procopius estimates at about 3,000. 3,000. Dead in what must have been less than an hour of sustained close combat. An entire wing of the Persian army, not just defeated, but annihilated. The survivors, those who managed to extract themselves from the pocket before the encirclement closed completely, fled back toward the Persian camp. The coordination was perfect. The timing was precise. The execution was what happens when a 25-year-old tactical genius faces an opponent who assumes numerical superiority, trumps clever preparation. The fate of Pityaxis himself goes unrecorded by Procopius, either killed in the destruction of his command or among those who fled, but either way removed from the battle. His wing was gone. 3,000 of Pharas' 50,000 lay dead or dying in a geometric trap that had turned Persian strength into fatal exposure. Modern military analysts studying Procopius' account recognize this as a textbook example of the ambush formation that later theorists would call envelopment, hitting an enemy from multiple directions simultaneously to create psychological shock and prevent coordinated response. Belisarius didn't invent the concept. Hannibal had done it at Cannae 746 years earlier, but executing it with mixed forces, regular cavalry, Federate Huns, Germanic allies, while operating from a defensive position against a numerically superior enemy, demonstrated a sophistication that most generals would have struggled to achieve, even with better odds. The trenches didn't just slow the Persians. They created a killing pocket. The recessed center didn't just look vulnerable. It channeled attacks exactly where ambushes waited. The geography didn't just constrain deployment. It turned numerical superiority into fatal density. On the Persian left, watching his right wing disintegrate, Perazes faced a choice between disgrace and desperation. He'd lost 3,000 of his finest cavalry in what must have seemed like minutes. Standard doctrine said a prudent commander would withdraw, regroup, reconsider. But Perazes wasn't fighting just Belisarius. He was fighting the weight of Persian military reputation, the myth of inevitability that kept 100 conquered peoples in submission. To withdraw in the face of inferior numbers would shatter that myth more completely than any battlefield defeat. So he chose the only option pride allowed. He committed his ultimate weapon, the immortals. Here's where the battle should have ended. Here's where Persian tradition and Byzantine mathematics collided with the force of elite cavalry, whose reputation alone had won battles. Perazes, watching his right wing destroyed, made the decision that seemed both obvious and necessary. He reinforced his left wing with the best troops available, what historians identify as the Zayadan, the elite cavalry forces matching descriptions of the legendary immortals from other sources. Procopius doesn't use the term, quote, 5 in his account of Dara, but he describes, quote, 6 in terms that match what we know about this famous unit from other contemporary sources and archaeological evidence. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Persian military equipment from this period, documented in other sources and archaeological finds, included sophisticated armor. Some elite troops wore metal face masks that created an unfeeling, robotic appearance designed for psychological impact. Heavy lamellar or scale armor protecting both rider and horse. Long lances for shock charges. Composite bows for sustained fire. Swords for close combat. The warrior aristocracy of an empire that had been perfecting cavalry warfare since the Achaemenid period. Command of this reinforced left wing fell to Barismanes. The target was John the Armenian's cavalry on the Byzantine right. The objective was straightforward. Break through, roll up the Byzantine line from the flank, salvage a battle that was rapidly deteriorating. The assault came with overwhelming force, massed heavy cavalry at full gallop, ironclad warriors on armored horses generating momentum that could shatter infantry formations and sweep aside lighter cavalry through sheer kinetic impact. This was what Persian cavalry was bred, trained, and equipped to do. This was the tactic that had won empires. John the Armenian faced pressure that no amount of courage could fully withstand. The elite of the Persian army, committed in mass, charging with the desperation of men who knew they had to break through or face comprehensive defeat. Procopius records what any honest military historian would acknowledge. John's cavalry couldn't hold against this assault. But couldn't hold isn't the same as couldn't fight. John's withdrawal was fighting retreat, not rout. Organized, disciplined, giving ground while maintaining formation, inflicting casualties even while being pushed back. The kind of defensive combat that buys time and preserves force even in the face of superior pressure. The Byzantines fell back toward Dara's walls. The Persians pursued hard, pressing their advantage, sensing breakthrough. For those watching, and Belisarius was watching from his central position with the intensity of a man whose entire plan depended on what happened next. This must have looked like the moment Byzantine resistance collapsed. The Persian left surged forward. The elite cavalry that had never known defeat drove deeper into Byzantine territory. Victory seemed not just possible, but imminent. After the disaster on their right, after 3,000 dead in the wing battles, the Persians finally had momentum, finally had breakthrough, finally had the kind of decisive advantage that their numerical superiority should have provided from the beginning. But victory in sight created its own vulnerability. The vigorous pursuit, the determination to break the Byzantine right completely, the commitment of the immortals and supporting cavalry to a deep penetration. All of this created something that Procopius notes with the precision of a man who recognized tactical significance when he saw it. A gap, a separation between the Persian left wing and the Persian center. Not a small gap, not a temporary fluctuation in the line. A substantial separation created by the left wing's pursuit of John's withdrawing cavalry. The immortals, focused entirely on destroying the Byzantine right, had pulled away from their supporting units. They'd created a pocket of empty space between themselves and the rest of the Persian army. From his central position, Belisarius could see what the Persians, committed to their assault and focused on the enemy directly in front of them, could not. He could see the gap. He could see the opportunity. He could see that the Persian elite had separated themselves from mutual support in their eagerness to deliver the decisive blow. He had seconds to decide. 3 seconds. Maybe. The time it takes to process what you're seeing, evaluate options, commit forces that if wrongly employed would lose the battle irrevocably. Commit the reserve or watch the empire fall. Every general's nightmare, every commander's defining moment. The Persians surged forward, confident they were winning. The Byzantines on the right retreated, fighting for survival. And in the center, a 25-year-old commander looked at the battlefield geometry and saw mathematics realigning in his favor. 3 seconds. That's all Belisarius had to process what he saw and commit forces that, if wrong, would lose the empire. The observation was simple. The Persian left wing, elite cavalry, historians identify them as the immortals, the best troops the Sassanid Empire could field, had pursued John the Armenian so vigorously they'd separated from the Persian center. There was a gap, empty space, a tactical opportunity that might exist for minutes or might close in seconds as Persian commanders recognized the danger and adjusted. The decision was instant. Commit everything. Procopius records that Belisarius ordered his reserves forward. The 1,200 Hun cavalry under Sunicus and Igon, the other half of the force that hadn't been committed to the right wing battle, plus his own Busalari, approximately 1,500 to 2,000 cavalry total, though Procopius doesn't specify exact Bucellarii numbers. These were his last reserves, everything he had left uncommitted. If this failed, if the Persians counterattacked successfully, if the gap closed and trapped his cavalry, the battle was lost. The city was lost. The eastern frontier was lost. The maneuver Procopius describes uses a term that military historians recognize. The cavalry wheeled across the battlefield. Not a straight charge. A curving movement from the center position toward the Byzantine right, moving through the space behind the central trench, exploiting the interior lines that the entire defensive system had been designed to enable. The speed must have been extraordinary. Cavalry moving at full gallop across ground their commander had personally surveyed and prepared. No obstacles, no trenches blocking their path. The Persians, separated by the gap, couldn't effectively respond. The center was too far away. The left wing was fully engaged with John and didn't see the threat approaching from their flank and rear. The strike hit exactly where gaps in ancient battles are most vulnerable. The flank and rear of forces committed to frontal combat. The immortals, focused on destroying John's cavalry, suddenly found themselves under attack from a direction they hadn't secured. Hadn't even considered as a threat because there shouldn't have been Byzantine forces available to attack from there. But there were. Because Belisarius had maintained reserves. Because he'd positioned himself to observe and respond. Because he'd understood that in battle, the side that can commit fresh forces at the decisive point usually wins regardless of overall numerical ratios. The Persians were trapped. The same geometry that had destroyed their right wing now caged their left. In front of them, John the Armenian's cavalry, which had been retreating moments before, rallied and countercharged. From the flank and rear, Belisarius's reserve struck with the momentum of cavalry that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The hills and the city walls prevented lateral escape. The gap between the left wing and center meant no immediate reinforcement was possible. The immortals, the elite of the Persian military, found themselves in a pocket between three forces with nowhere to go. What happened next? Procopius records with the kind of specific detail that suggests he had access to eyewitness accounts from multiple participants. Sunicus, the Hun commander who'd already helped destroy the Persian right, personally engaged Barismanes. The combat specifics aren't detailed. Procopius focuses on the outcome rather than the method. But the result was decisive and symbolically devastating. Sunicus killed Barismanes, the commander of the Persian left wing, the general leading what historians identify as the immortal contingent, fell in personal combat. And Sunicus captured his standard, the command flag that represented Barismanes' authority and the unit's cohesion. The impact of losing a commander and seeing the standard fall cannot be overstated in ancient warfare. Modern armies have elaborate command structures with clear lines of succession. Ancient armies depended heavily on personal leadership and visual symbols. When the standard fell, when the commander died, cohesion shattered. The systematic destruction of the Persian elite in that pocket must have taken time. Perhaps an hour of sustained close combat. But once encircled, once their commander was dead and their standard captured, the outcome was mathematical certainty. Procopius estimates more than 5,000 Persians died in this phase of the battle. 5,000. The right wing had cost 3,000. Now the left wing was costing 5,000. 8,000 total. 16% of the Persian army dead in two catastrophic wing battles. The finest cavalry the Sassanid Empire could field, systematically destroyed by a force half their size. The mathematics that should have guaranteed Persian victory had been rewritten by a 25-year-old who understood that numbers mean nothing if you can control where and when they can be brought to bear. The immortals, warriors whose very name suggested they couldn't be killed, whose reputation alone had won battles, proved mortal after all. In the Persian center, infantry and remaining cavalry watched both wings disintegrate. Watched 8,000 of their finest soldiers die in traps they'd charged into with confidence. Watched the myth of Persian invincibility shatter against Byzantine geometry and timing so precise it seemed supernatural. What happened next wasn't battle. It was mathematics finally catching up with arrogance. The Persian center, tens of thousands of infantry and cavalry who had yet to strike a blow, watched both wings disintegrate. And then they ran. Procopius records what followed with the economy of a chronicler documenting something unprecedented in Persian military history. The center abandoned their positions without ever coming to close combat with the Byzantine infantry waiting behind the central trench. They threw away their wicker shields. They fled toward their camp at Amodios. This wasn't organized withdrawal. This wasn't tactical retreat to regroup and reform. This was panic. Discipline vanishing, units abandoning their formations, elite troops fleeing without orders. The psychological collapse was comprehensive. These warriors had watched the impossible become real. They'd seen their right wing destroyed despite following standard cavalry doctrine. They'd seen their elite left wing annihilated despite being the finest cavalry in Asia. They'd watched 8,000 of their brothers die in geometric traps that turned Persian strength into vulnerability. And now, with both wings gone, with the Byzantine center still intact and unengaged behind their trenches, with Belisarius's reserves presumably available for another devastating counterstroke, the Persian infantry did what infantry has always done when cavalry protection evaporates and defeat seems certain. They decided survival mattered more than honor. Byzantine cavalry pursued. The flight of 40,000+ warriors created chaos that multiplied casualties. Horses collided. Men trampled their own comrades. Narrow paths that had allowed organized advance became fatal bottlenecks when tens of thousands tried to flee simultaneously. Procopius records that the pursuit continued for a distance he describes as, quote, 8. He doesn't specify exactly how far, but far enough to inflict additional casualties on fleeing Persians. Then Belisarius did something that military historians recognize as the mark of a commander who understands the difference between tactical victory and strategic disaster. He called off the pursuit. His reasoning, as Procopius presents it, was threefold. First, wariness of Persian tactical discipline. The Persians were famous for their ability to regroup even after setbacks, to turn apparent retreats into ambushes for overconfident pursuers. Second, fear of ambush in unfamiliar territory beyond the immediate battlefield. Third, and perhaps most important, the desire to maintain army cohesion and control. Victory was won. The Persians were fleeing, but an army that pursues too eagerly can fragment into individual glory seekers who lose formation and become vulnerable to counterattack. Belisarius, having executed near-perfect tactical geometry all day, wasn't about to risk it all for a few hundred more Persian casualties. His troops obeyed. The Byzantine cavalry halted, reformed, returned to their positions. Discipline maintained even in the flush of overwhelming victory. What the Persians left behind told its own story about the completeness of their collapse. Siege equipment, catapults capable of reducing fortress walls, powder weapons representing cutting-edge military technology, supplies for a month's campaign, all abandoned in the panic. Among the equipment lay something more symbolic: personal standards of generals, items that Persian warriors would normally die defending. But when discipline shatters, when survival becomes paramount, even honor becomes expendable. The battlefield presented grim accounting. The Persian right wing, approximately 3,000 dead. The Persian left wing and immortals, more than 5,000 dead. Additional casualties in the rout and pursuit. Numbers Procopius doesn't separately tally, but that certainly added to the total. 8,000 to 10,000 Persian dead seems to be Procopius's estimate when combining his phase-by-phase counts. Byzantine casualties? Procopius provides no specific numbers, a common practice when reporting victories, to emphasize the one-sided nature of the outcome. Modern military historians, analyzing typical ancient battle ratios and the fact that both Byzantine wings were initially pushed back before counterattacking successfully, estimate losses were significantly lower than Persian, perhaps 1,000 to 3,000. But this remains entirely speculative. What we know for certain is that Byzantine losses were low enough that Procopius saw no need to mention them, suggesting a decisive victory rather than a mutual bloodbath. The casualty ratio tells the story. Even accepting the most conservative estimates, The Byzantines inflicted 3-1 or better casualties despite being outnumbered 2-1. If the higher estimates are accurate, 8,000 to 10,000 Persian dead versus perhaps 1 to 2,000 Byzantine. The ratio approaches 5-1 or worse for the Persians. The horse carnage added insult to catastrophe. Hundreds of Persian cavalry mounts. Procopius and later sources suggest approximately 400, though this number needs careful verification, lay dead or abandoned on the battlefield. Many had drowned when the ice crossing collapsed during the initial assault. Others had been killed in the wing battles. Still others wandered the battlefield, their riders dead, eating the fallen in a scene that contemporaries would have found both grotesque and symbolic. Years of careful breeding. Generations of selecting for the best cavalry horses from the steppes and Persian stud farms, destroyed in hours. As the sun set on that June day in 530, the battlefield belonged to silence and scavengers. 8,000 to 10,000 Persian bodies scattered across approximately 3 square miles of marsh and valley. Byzantine wounded limped toward Dara's gates. And in the distance, a broken Persian army stumbled toward Nisibis, carrying a message they'd never had to deliver before. The unstoppable had been stopped. The inevitable had been proven contingent. And a 25-year-old commander had demonstrated that sometimes mathematics doesn't matter. Sometimes geometry decides. Dawn on the second day revealed what mathematics had wrought. Bodies, thousands of them, scattered across the battlefield in patterns that told the story of systematic slaughter. The Persian dead concentrated in 2 areas. The right wing killing pocket, where approximately 3,000 had died trapped between Pharis's Heruli, Sunicus's Huns, and Baucis's countercharging cavalry. The left wing encirclement, where more than 5,000 elite Persian cavalry, forces historians identify as the immortals, had been destroyed between John's rallied troops and Belisarius's reserves. Procopius's phase-by-phase casualty estimates total over 8,000 Persian dead. Additional casualties during the rout and pursuit, which he doesn't separately enumerate, likely pushed the final count toward or above 10,000. For an army of 50,000, that represents a casualty rate between 16 and 20%. Catastrophic by any measure. For elite cavalry units, irreplaceable losses that would take years to rebuild. Byzantine casualties present a historical gap. Procopius doesn't provide specific Byzantine casualty figures, a common practice in victory narratives, where minimizing friendly losses emphasizes the decisiveness of the outcome. Modern military historians, analyzing typical ancient battle ratios and the documented fact that both Byzantine wings were initially pushed back before counterattacking, estimate losses significantly lower than Persian, perhaps 1,000 to 3,000 killed and wounded combined. But this remains entirely speculative. We have no primary source numbers. What we know for certain is that Procopius felt no need to discuss Byzantine casualties in detail, which suggests they were either minimal or at least acceptable in the context of such a decisive victory. Among the Persian dead abandoned on the field, Procopius notes over 300 wounded who had been left behind during the rout. In the June Mesopotamian night, with temperatures dropping despite the summer season, these men would have faced hypothermia and death from exposure if their wounds hadn't already proven fatal. Ancient battlefield medicine offered limited help even for those who could be evacuated. For those abandoned, death was merely a question of timing. The battlefield itself sprawled across approximately 3 square miles of valley, marsh, and hillside. The concentrated killing in the wing battles left the densest corpse fields, but bodies scattered along pursuit routes and near the trenches told the fuller story of a battle that had seen sustained combat across multiple phases. Equipment littered the ground. Broken lances. Arrows by the tens of thousands. Procopius's description of the opening archery exchange as a underscore quote underscore 9 underscore suggests expenditure that would have left the battlefield looking like a forest of shafts. Persian armor, some pierced by Byzantine blades, some abandoned as fleeing warriors shed weight to run faster. Wicker shields thrown away in panic. Among the debris lay the siege equipment the Persians had abandoned. Catapults that could reduce fortress walls. Powder weapons, early explosive technology that the Persians had adapted from Chinese sources. Fire lances that could project flame. Supply wagons for a month's campaign, all left behind when discipline collapsed and survival became paramount. The Persian retreat to Nisibis, barely 18 to 22 kilometers away, must have been agony for the survivors. Defeated, demoralized, having watched their elite units destroyed by an army half their size. Perozes, the supreme commander who'd sent that arrogant message about having lunch in Dara, now had to explain to King Kavad I how 50,000 warriors had been routed by 25,000 Byzantines. The Byzantine response to victory was characteristically cautious. They held their defensive position at Dara. They did not attempt to pursue into Persian territory beyond the immediate battlefield. They secured the abandoned equipment. They tended their wounded. They buried their dead with whatever ceremony field conditions and exhaustion allowed. The immediate political impact rippled outward faster than messengers could write. For Belisarius, reputation established. Justinian's gamble on a young, relatively unknown commander had been vindicated spectacularly. The emperor would remember this when planning future campaigns. For Justinian himself, confidence in his military reforms confirmed. The divided command structure, the investment in frontier fortifications, the willingness to promote based on merit rather than aristocratic connection, all validated by results. For Persia, shock. The Sassanid Empire had been waging successful warfare against Rome for centuries. They'd grown accustomed to winning when they held numerical superiority. This defeat challenged assumptions that underpinned their entire military doctrine. If 50,000 warriors couldn't break 25,000 defenders in prepared positions, what did that mean for future campaigns? What did it mean for the empire's ability to project power westward? For the Byzantine frontier, breathing space. The Persian army that retreated to Nisibis wasn't in condition to mount another offensive immediately. They'd need time to rebuild, time to replace casualties, time to restore morale and confidence. That time, measured in weeks or months, was time Byzantine commanders could use to strengthen other positions, reinforce garrisons, prepare for the campaigns they knew would eventually come. The human cost transcended statistics. 8,000 to 10,000 Persian men dead. Husbands, fathers, sons, brothers. Each one represented a family that would receive news of loss. Each one represented training and experience that couldn't be instantly replaced. The elite cavalry units had been the warrior aristocracy of Persian society. Their losses would be felt not just militarily, but socially and economically. For the Byzantines, even the most optimistic casualty estimates meant 1,000 to 3,000 families receiving similar news. Victory's price is always paid in blood. The difference was that Byzantine blood had purchased something tangible: time, reputation, and the knowledge that numerical inferiority didn't necessarily mean defeat. The immediate battle was over, but the ripples of what happened in that gap of land between hills would spread across empires, forcing peace negotiations, enabling Western campaigns, and teaching a fundamental lesson about warfare that every military academy would eventually study. Sometimes the only way to defeat superior numbers is to make victory more expensive than defeat. Belisarius had turned mathematics inside out, and 8,000 Persian corpses proved the equation worked. The so-called eternal peace lasted exactly 8 years, but those 8 years changed the map of the Mediterranean. Dara wasn't the only Byzantine victory in 530. Later that same year, at the Battle of Satala, Byzantine forces defeated another Persian army. The combined pressure from multiple defeats forced King Kavad I to reassess. The Sassanid Empire, which had been winning most engagements in this theater for years, suddenly faced the reality that they couldn't simply overwhelm Roman defenses through numerical superiority. The strategic calculus shifted. 8,000 casualties at Dara had weakened the Persian Western Army substantially. The destruction of elite cavalry units, those forces historians identify as the immortals, meant replacing not just warriors, but the experienced core of cavalry formations that took years to develop. Equipment could be forged. Horses could be bred. But the collective experience and tactical sophistication of veteran cavalry units couldn't be instantly recreated. Persia's failure, combined with setbacks elsewhere, created a command crisis in the Persian military establishment. When a general commanding 50,000 warriors loses to a force half that size, questions get asked. Reassignments happen. Doctrine gets reconsidered. The specific fate of Persias after his defeat goes unrecorded in our sources. Persian records from this period have largely vanished into history's gaps. But the magnitude of the disaster suggests his career suffered accordingly. Negotiations began in 531 and culminated in the Treaty of 532 that both sides called the Eternal Peace. Procopius records the terms with the precision of a man documenting diplomatic compromise. All captured territories would be returned to their original owners, status quo ante bellum, and the Byzantines would pay 11,000 pounds, 5,000 kilograms of gold to the Persians. That tribute deserves examination. Despite winning the major battles, despite Dara and Satala, despite forcing the Persians to negotiate, Byzantium still paid gold. This wasn't total Byzantine victory. This was mutual exhaustion, recognizing that neither empire could decisively defeat the other. The Persians accepted peace because continuing the war would cost more in blood and treasure than the tribute would provide. The Byzantines accepted the tribute because it bought them something more valuable than gold. Time. 8 years, as it turned out. In 540, the new Persian king Khosrau I broke the peace and invaded Syria. The eternal peace proved about as eternal as most diplomatic agreements backed by nothing more than mutual convenience. The cycle of Byzantine-Persian warfare resumed. But those 8 years between 532 and 540 allowed Justinian to pursue the dream that defined his reign: reconquest of the Western Mediterranean. With the eastern frontier stabilized by treaty, with the Persian threat neutralized temporarily, the emperor could send armies west. In 533, Belisarius sailed for North Africa at the head of an expeditionary force. His target, the Vandal kingdom that had seized Rome's richest African provinces a century earlier. The campaign was swift and decisive. At the Battle of Tricomarum in December 533, Belisarius destroyed the Vandal field army. By March 534, the Vandal kingdom ceased to exist. North Africa was Roman again. The connection to Dara was direct. Without the eternal peace, Justinian couldn't have risked sending his best general and a substantial field army to Africa. The Persians would have exploited the absence by attacking the eastern frontier. Dara didn't just save the Mesopotamian border. It enabled Mediterranean reconquest. The Italian campaign followed. 535 saw Belisarius invading Sicily. 536, he entered Rome. By 540, he'd captured Ravenna and destroyed the Ostrogothic kingdom's military capacity. Italy, the heart of the old Western Empire, was back under Roman control. All of this became possible because of what happened in a narrow valley near Dara in June 530. One battle didn't win Justinian's wars of reconquest, but it bought the time that made those wars possible. The long-term strategic consequences extended beyond Justinian's reign. Dara demonstrated that the Byzantine military, properly led and prepared, could defeat Persian forces in open battle. This wasn't a siege defense where walls did the work. This wasn't a guerrilla campaign where Romans avoided direct confrontation. This was 25,000 Byzantines standing in the open against 50,000 Persians and winning decisively. That psychological shift mattered. Byzantine commanders in later wars knew that numerical inferiority didn't automatically mean defeat. Persian commanders knew that numerical superiority didn't automatically guarantee victory. The mythology of inevitable Persian triumph when they held the numbers advantage had been shattered. But the ultimate strategic reality was stalemate. Neither Byzantium nor Persia could decisively defeat the other. They fought for another century with the borders shifting back and forth, but no permanent breakthrough on either side. The mutual exhaustion from these endless wars weakened both empires so severely that when Arab armies emerged from the peninsula in the 7th century, the conquest of both Byzantine Syria, Egypt, and Sassanid Mesopotamia happened with shocking speed. Dara bought time, 8 years of peace, enabling dreams of reconquest, demonstrating tactical possibilities. But time, once spent, doesn't accumulate. And empires that buy survival with gold tribute and tactical genius are empires that have already lost the strategic competition. They just haven't admitted it yet. Still, for that moment in 532 when the eternal peace was signed, it must have seemed like victory. Persian tribute acknowledged, Western campaigns enabled, a young general proven, an emperor's judgment vindicated. 8 years. In the span of history, barely a breath. But sometimes that breath is all you need to change everything that follows. What Belisarius did at Dara appears in exactly 0 other ancient battles. Military historians still argue whether he invented the system or perfected existing concepts. Either way, the execution changed how warfare was understood. The field fortification geometry represents the most visible innovation. Survey of ancient military literature confirms that Procopius's description is unique. Other generals dug trenches. Romans were famous for entrenching every camp. But this specific geometric configuration, recessed center, forward projecting wings, earthen bridges for mobility, appears nowhere else in detailed form. The sophistication wasn't just in the physical structure, but in the tactical theory it embodied. The recessed center created psychological bait, inviting attacks on wings where ambushes waited. The forward projections covered Byzantine flanks, while channeling Persian approaches into narrow corridors. The earthen bridges enabled Byzantine cavalry to cross their own fortifications for counterattacks, while Persian cavalry faced solid obstacles. Modern military theory calls this operating on interior lines, maintaining a central position that allows rapid movement of reserves to threaten sectors. Belisarius was executing this principle 15 centuries before Jomini and other theorists formally codified it. The younger force, operating from interior lines, can mass at the decision point faster than a larger force operating on exterior lines that must move greater distances to respond. Combined arms coordination represents the second innovation. Not the concept itself. Rome had been integrating different troop types for centuries. But the seamless execution under unified command of so many disparate elements. Infantry holding the center, heavy cavalry on the wings, light horse archers at the angles, concealed Germanic cavalry in ambush, Hunnish federates for flanking attacks, personal guard reserves held for decisive commitment. Each element had a specific role. Each role supported the others. When Pharis struck the Persian right in the rear, it created chaos that allowed Sunicus's Huns to devastate the flank, which enabled Buzes to countercharge successfully. When Belisarius committed his reserves against the Persian left, John's cavalry rallied and attacked from the opposite direction. Perfect coordination. Not luck, design. The Byzantine military manual known as the Strategikon, compiled around 590 AD, roughly 60 years after Dara, incorporates principles that military historians recognize as similar to what Belisarius demonstrated. Combined arms integration, defensive fortifications as offensive weapons, flexible reserve employment, psychological warfare tactics. Whether the Strategikon drew directly on lessons from Dara is debated by scholars. Procopius's detailed account was available to later Byzantine military theorists. Belisarius's reputation as the empire's greatest general would have ensured his methods were studied. The chronological connection, Dara in 530, Strategikon around 590, suggests at least possible influence, even if direct causation can't be proven. The psychological operations deserve recognition as deliberate doctrine rather than happy accident. The Andreas duels weren't random events that Belisarius exploited opportunistically. The decision to allow a bath attendant to fight Persian champions was calculated risk. If Andreas lost, Byzantine morale would suffer. But if he won, as someone must have believed he could, the impact on both armies would be substantial. The trench positioning itself constituted psychological warfare. By making the center look vulnerable, Belisarius encouraged exactly the kind of wing attacks that his geometry and ambushes were designed to defeat. The Persians weren't stupid. They were doing what centuries of successful cavalry doctrine taught them to do. Belisarius had simply created a battlefield where following doctrine led to disaster. Modern military academies study Dara for these principles, not because ancient battles have direct applicability to modern mechanized warfare, but because the underlying concepts, terrain as force multiplier, numerical inferiority overcome through tactical superiority, unity of command enabling coordinated operations, reserve timing as decisive factor, remain relevant regardless of technological era. The Battle of Dara appears in curricula at military institutions specifically as an example of defensive excellence. How to defeat a numerically superior attacker through preparation, positioning, and precise execution. The specific tactics, trenches, cavalry, composite bows, are obsolete. The principles are timeless, but innovations, however brilliant, have limits. The following year, 531, saw the Battle of Callinicum. Belisarius faced Persians again and lost. The defeat was comprehensive enough that Justinian convened a commission of inquiry and temporarily dismissed Belisarius from command. This demonstrates something military historians emphasize. Tactics alone don't guarantee victory. Execution matters. Circumstances matter. Enemy adaptation matters. Terrain, weather, troop quality, morale, intelligence, fortune. All these variables combine in ways that make even genius generalship uncertain. Belisarius was brilliant, but he wasn't invincible. The Byzantine Empire couldn't systematically replicate his tactical genius. Other commanders, using similar methods, achieved mixed results. Personal brilliance, by definition, resists institutionalization. Modern militaries attempt to solve this problem through doctrine, training, and technology, trying to make excellence systematic rather than dependent on individual genius. The tension between personal leadership and institutional competence remains unresolved. Dara suggests both matter. The system Belisarius designed was sophisticated, but executing it required a commander calm enough, perceptive enough, and decisive enough to see the gap opening between Persian wings and commit reserves instantly. The geometry provided opportunity. Genius recognized it and acted. Neither alone would have sufficed. 15 centuries later, the tactical innovations Belisarius demonstrated remain subjects of study and debate. The trenches have long since filled with earth and time. But the principles they embodied, that preparation beats numbers, that tactics can overcome technology, that geometry properly applied becomes artillery. Those principles wait in every military manual for armies arrogant enough to forget them. Victory immortalizes moments. But what about the men who made them? Flavius Belisarius, 25 years old at Dara, would go on to compile one of the most spectacular military careers in history. North Africa in 533 through 534. Italy from 535 through 540, and again in 544 through 549. Syria in 541, defending against Persian invasion. His last major campaign came in 559, defending Constantinople against Hun attacks. Procopius chronicled most of these campaigns in his wars, providing extraordinary detail about Belisarius's tactics, victories, and occasional setbacks. The portrait that emerges is of a commander who maintained his tactical sophistication throughout his career, who adapted to different enemies and circumstances, who won more often than he lost. But success bred jealousy and suspicion. In 562, Belisarius faced accusations of conspiracy against Justinian. The charges were almost certainly false, political intrigue rather than actual treason. But they were enough to end his career. He fell from imperial favor. The final years of his life, from 563 to his death in March 565, were spent in semi-retirement or house arrest. He died approximately 60 years old. Only months before Justinian himself, his death brought an end to the military partnership that had reconquered half the Mediterranean. Later medieval legends claimed that Belisarius was blinded and reduced to begging in the streets of Constantinople. Modern historians have thoroughly debunked this myth. No contemporary source, not Procopius, not Agathias, not any Byzantine chronicler from the period, mentions blinding. The story appears to be later invention. Medieval romance adding tragic elements to history. Belisarius died in relative disgrace politically, but not blind and not destitute. The irony was perfect and bitter. Rome's greatest general since Julius Caesar, the man who'd reconquered North Africa and Italy, who defeated Persians and Vandals and Goths, died suspected of treason by the emperor he'd served faithfully for over 30 years. Success is no guarantee of reward. Loyalty is no insurance against suspicion. Hermogenes, the co-commander at Dara who provided political oversight while Belisarius directed tactics, continued serving Justinian in diplomatic and administrative roles. Procopius mentions him occasionally in contexts suggesting continued imperial favor. but details of his later career remain limited in our sources. Perazes simply vanishes from history after Dara. Procopius, meticulous about the battle itself, falls silent on the Persian commander's fate, presumably disgraced, possibly executed, demoted, or quietly retired. Persian sources from this period have largely been lost, taking with them whatever records existed of Perazes' explanation to King Kavad I for how 50,000 warriors were routed by 25,000 Byzantines. We'll never know what happened to the supreme commander who sent that arrogant message about having lunch in Dara. History preserved his hubris, but not his punishment. Barismanes died on the field, killed in personal combat by Sunicus, according to Procopius' account. His body's fate goes unrecorded, captured by Byzantines, recovered by retreating Persians, left on the battlefield. We don't know. What we know is that his death, combined with the capture of his standard, triggered the collapse of the Persian left wing. Pityaxes, commander of the destroyed Persian right wing, also vanishes from the record, presumably killed in the destruction of his command or among those who fled. But Procopius doesn't specify. Another casualty of historical silence. And Andreas? The bath attendant who defeated 2 Persian champions and changed the psychological tenor of the entire battle. Procopius never mentions him again after describing the duels on day 1. Not in the main battle account, not in later campaigns, not anywhere. The most dramatically important individual warrior of the battle, the man whose victories shattered Persian confidence and boosted Byzantine morale, disappears from history completely. Likely, he received rewards. Standard practice would suggest promotion, land grants, monetary compensation. Possibly he was given a formal military commission and served in later campaigns without achieving notable individual glory that would warrant mention in chronicles. But we don't know. History remembers his 2 duels and then forgets him entirely. Perhaps that's appropriate. War celebrates systems and commanders. It buries individuals beneath the weight of greater narratives. Sunicus, the Hun commander who killed Barismanes and helped destroy both Persian wings, continued serving under Belisarius. Procopius mentions him in accounts of later campaigns, suggesting a successful military career in Byzantine service. The Federates who proved so critical at Dara, Huns and Heruli fighting for Roman gold, demonstrated their value and presumably saw continued employment. Fares, whose 300 Heruli erupted from behind the hill to devastate the Persian right wing, also appears in Procopius' account of the North African campaign in 533 through 534. He continued serving under Belisarius with distinction. Bauses and John the Armenian, the wing commanders who absorbed Persian assaults and then counterattacked successfully. Both continued military careers. John eventually became one of Justinian's most important generals, though his career later ended badly amid complex political intrigue. The pattern emerges clearly. Commanders preserved in history tend to be those who continued achieving notable things. Individual warriors, no matter how critical their contribution to a specific battle, vanish unless they went on to sustained careers worthy of chronicle attention. Victory immortalizes moments. It forgets men. The trenches Belisarius designed are studied in military academies. The name of the bath attendant who gave his army confidence? Lost to time. The tactical decisions that destroyed 8,000 Persians are analyzed by scholars. The soldiers who executed those decisions? Statistics. Perhaps war has always worked this way. Celebrating systems, remembering innovations, forgetting that both require human beings willing to risk everything for outcomes they won't personally enjoy. Belisarius lived to see his victories, and his disgrace. Andreas disappeared into history's silence. Borismanus died knowing his elite cavalry had broken. Perazes faced whatever punishment awaits generals who lose battles they should have won. Different fates, same battlefield, same June day in 530 when mathematics bent backwards and impossible became real. Ask 100 history students to name ancient battles. Maybe 3 will say Dara. Why did history bury one of its most tactically brilliant engagements? The source problem explains much of the obscurity. Procopius provides the only detailed account of the battle. John Malalas's chronicle mentions it briefly. Zacharias Reader's Syriac church history notes the conflict's existence. But compared to battles like Marathon or Thermopylae, which appear in multiple contemporary sources with varying perspectives, Dara depends almost entirely on one voice. Persian sources from this period have largely vanished. The Sassanid Empire's records, whatever detailed accounts they maintained of this disaster, were lost to time and the chaos of later conquests. What we have from the Persian perspective comes filtered through Byzantine chroniclers who had obvious biases about presenting Roman victories favorably. Single-source dependency makes battles vulnerable to historical forgetting. When only one detailed account survives, the battle's preservation depends on that account's continued transmission and study. Procopius was widely read in Byzantium and preserved through medieval manuscript tradition. But his focus on Byzantine military history meant Western European scholars, more interested in Roman Republic and early imperial periods, often skipped or minimized his wars. The outcome problem compounds the issue. Dara was a defensive victory. No territory permanently changed hands. The strategic situation after the battle remained essentially what it had been before. 2 empires in stalemate, neither able to decisively defeat the other. The eternal peace of 532 required Byzantine gold tribute, which from certain perspectives makes the war outcome ambiguous despite battlefield success. Contrast this with battles like Actium, which ended the Roman civil wars and established Augustus's empire, or Adrianople, which shattered Roman military power and enabled Germanic migrations. Decisive strategic outcomes that changed political realities tend to be remembered more than tactical brilliance that led to negotiated stalemates. The narrative problem affects public memory even when historians know better. Dara's brilliance is technical. The geometry of the trenches, the coordination of combined arms, the precise timing of reserve commitment. These are sophisticated concepts that require military knowledge to fully appreciate. Much harder to dramatize than Thermopylae's 300 Spartans standing against Persian millions. Personal heroism makes better stories than tactical geometry. Andreas's duels provide the kind of personal drama that public memory prefers. But they weren't the decisive element of the battle. They were psychological preparation for the tactical execution that actually won. Historical memory tends to inflate what's dramatic at the expense of what's decisive. The chronological problem affected transmission. Dara occurred in 530 AD. Within a century, both Byzantium and Persia faced existential threats from Arab expansion. The Byzantine-Persian rivalry that made Dara important became historically superseded by the Islamic conquests that reshaped the entire Middle East. Neither successor state to these empires, not the medieval Byzantine rump state, not the Islamic caliphates, had particular reason to celebrate a battle from the old rivalry. The triumphalist narrative that usually preserves military victories requires a continuous political entity to claim the legacy. When that entity fragments or is conquered, battlefield memories fragment with it. Western European historical memory which dominated medieval and early modern scholarship, focused overwhelmingly on Western European events and the Roman Empire of Caesar and Augustus. Byzantine history was often treated as footnote or decline narrative. The battles that shaped Eastern Mediterranean politics in the 6th century simply weren't part of the story Western Europeans told themselves about their past. The rediscovery began in the 20th century with military historians who recognized Dara's tactical significance. J.F.C. Fuller, the influential British military theorist, analyzed the battle as an example of defensive excellence. John Haldon and other Byzantine military specialists provided detailed scholarly analysis. Christopher Lillington Martin's satellite imagery research between 2007 and 2013 confirmed Procopius's account and identified the probable battlefield location with precision. Modern military academies discovered value in studying Dara. The principles demonstrated terrain as force multiplier, numerical inferiority overcome through tactical superiority, combined arms coordination, interior lines doctrine, remain relevant across technological eras. What couldn't be remembered as epic national triumph could be studied as technical masterclass. Lillington Martin's archaeological work deserves particular mention. Using satellite imagery, he identified geographical features matching Procopius's description. The Gap of Dara, the hills flanking the city, the narrow valley approach. The confirmation that Procopius's tactical account aligns with actual topography vindicates the reliability of our primary source and enables confident reconstruction of what happened. The battlefield today lies in southeastern Turkey near Mardin province. The ruins of Dara, partially standing walls, the Great Cistern, water gates can be visited. The battlefield itself is agricultural land without monuments or markers. No plaques commemorate where 8,000 Persians died. No museum preserves artifacts from the battle. Just ruins of a fortress that once anchored an empire's frontier and fields that don't remember the blood they drank. Why history forgets follows patterns. Personal drama trumps tactical complexity. Decisive strategic outcomes overshadow brilliant but inconclusive battles. Multiple sources preserve memory better than single accounts. Continuous political entities maintain triumphalist narratives that fragmented or conquered states cannot. Dara failed most of these tests. One detailed source, technical rather than narrative brilliance. Strategic stalemate despite tactical victory. No political successor to claim the legacy. The wonder isn't that Dara faded from popular memory. The wonder is that we know about it at all. But knowing about it matters. Because the lessons it teaches, about preparation overcoming numbers, about tactical innovation enabling the weak to defeat the strong, about the decisive importance of leadership and geometry, those lessons don't expire. They just wait for commanders arrogant enough to think superior numbers guarantee victory. And then, if those commanders are unlucky enough to face someone who studied what happened in a narrow valley in June 530, mathematics realigns itself. Modern armies fighting insurgencies learn what Perazes learned in 530. The side with more soldiers doesn't always win. The first lesson Dara teaches is terrain as force multiplier. Belisarius used the Gap of Dara to negate Persian numerical superiority, channeling 50,000 warriors into approaches where perhaps 5,000 to 8,000 could engage simultaneously. Modern military doctrine codifies this principle. Defenders who understand terrain can neutralize technological and numerical advantages. Vietnam demonstrated this repeatedly. American forces with overwhelming firepower and mobility advantages struggled against Viet Cong, who understood the terrain intimately and used it to dictate engagement conditions. Afghanistan showed similar patterns. The principle is timeless. If you can control where and how combat occurs, you can offset disadvantages in numbers and equipment. The second lesson is engineering as warfare. Belisarius didn't just dig trenches for protection. He created a geometric system that enabled mobility while restricting enemy maneuver. The earthen bridges let Byzantine cavalry cross for counterattacks. The channeling forced Persians into corridors where they couldn't mass. This principle echoes through military history. World War I trench warfare demonstrated defensive dominance. The Maginot Line showed what happens when static fortifications become ends rather than means. Modern field fortifications, from fire-based design to urban strongpoint construction, apply the same concept. Turn engineering into tactical advantage. The difference between Dara and failed fortification systems is mobility. Belisarius's trenches enabled counterattack, not just defense. The earthen bridges were force multipliers, not weaknesses. Engineering that prevents your own maneuver is prison. Engineering that restricts enemy maneuver while enabling your own is weapon. The third lesson is combined arms supremacy. Integration of infantry, heavy cavalry, light cavalry, and reserves under unified command, each element supporting the others. Pharas's ambush created chaos. Sunicus's flank attack exploited that chaos. Bauza's countercharge delivered the coup de grace. Perfect coordination. Modern militaries attempt this with air power, armor, infantry, and special forces. The challenge remains coordination. Technology has changed. The principle hasn't. The side that effectively integrates different capabilities usually defeats the side that relies on single strength, however overwhelming that strength might be. The fourth lesson is psychological warfare effectiveness. The Andreas duels shattered Persian confidence before the main battle began. Modern applications include special forces raids with disproportionate psychological impact, precision strikes chosen for psychological rather than purely material damage, information warfare designed to erode enemy morale. The principle is timeless. Morale matters as much as materiel. Soldiers who believe they're losing fight differently than soldiers confident in victory. Creating doubt in the enemy while building confidence in your own forces multiplies every other advantage. The fifth lesson is interior lines and reserve timing. Belisarius's central position allowed him to observe the entire battle and commit reserves where they would be decisive. When the gap appeared between Persian wings, he had forces available and positioned to exploit it instantly. Military theorists from Napoleon onward have emphasized this principle. The art of war is to mass your forces at the decisive point. Belisarius was executing this concept 15 centuries before it was formally codified. Economy of force in one sector. Overwhelming concentration at the decision point. The smaller force operating on interior lines can mass faster than the larger force operating on exterior lines. The sixth lesson addresses when numbers don't matter. Dara's mathematics defy simple arithmetic. 25,000 against 50,000 equals 2 to 1 disadvantage. Yet the casualty ratio ran 3 to 1 or better in Byzantine favor. 8,000 to 10,000 Persians dead. Perhaps 1 to 3,000 Byzantines lost. Though we should note this remains speculative since Procopius provides no Byzantine casualty figures. The principle. Force ratios aren't destiny. If terrain favors the defender, leadership is superior, tactics are innovative, morale is higher, and execution is precise. Numbers matter, but they're not everything. Quality can overcome quantity if the quality gap is large enough and properly employed. The seventh lesson acknowledges the limits of tactical genius. Belisarius lost at Callinicum the following year. Same general, similar enemy, different outcome. This demonstrates that tactics alone don't guarantee victory. Terrain, weather, troop quality, enemy adaptation, intelligence, fortune. Variables combine in ways that make even brilliant commanders fallible. Humility matters. Even genius has limits. The same principles that won at Dara didn't ensure success at Callinicum. Circumstances change. Enemies learn. Fortune shifts. Perfect execution of brilliant tactics can still end in defeat if enough variables align against you. The final lesson examines why it still matters 15 centuries later. Persius's error was assuming numerical superiority guaranteed victory. History provides endless examples of arrogant powers underestimating smaller opponents. Rome versus Germanic tribes. British Empire versus American colonies. Soviet Union in Afghanistan. United States in Vietnam. The pattern repeats because institutional memory fades and arrogance is perennial. Superior numbers, better equipment, professional military. These advantages create confidence that blinds commanders to vulnerabilities. Dara's warning remains relevant. Don't assume your advantages translate automatically to victory. 25 years old. First major command. Impossible odds. And Belisarius won through preparation, innovation, psychology, and execution so precise it seemed supernatural. The final accounting shows what genius combined with geometry can accomplish. 8,000 to 10,000 Persians dead. A 2-to-1 numerical disadvantage transformed into a 3-to-1 or better casualty advantage. An empire's finest cavalry destroyed by combined arms coordination and perfect timing. The principles demonstrated at Dara appear in every modern military manual. Terrain as weapon, engineering as tactics, combined arms integration, psychological operations, interior lines, reserve commitment timing, unity of command. These aren't ancient curiosities. They're timeless fundamentals that technology changes but doesn't eliminate. What Persius learned, arrogant commanders still learn. What Belisarius proved, outnumbered defenders still prove. Sometimes victory isn't about having more soldiers. Sometimes it's about making the enemy's numbers irrelevant through terrain, tactics, and timing so precise that mathematics itself bends backward. The gap still exists between those who understand warfare as arithmetic and those who understand it as geometry. Between those who think superior numbers guarantee victory and those who know that preparation, positioned properly, defeats unprepared superiority. Between arrogance and caution. Between doctrine and adaptation. 1,500 years haven't closed that gap. They've just provided more examples of what happens when armies forget the lessons. And Dara waits in the military history texts, ready to teach the same truths to the next generation of commanders who need to understand that sometimes mathematics doesn't matter. Sometimes genius does. We began with trenches, geometric precision carved into earth, lines that shouldn't have worked, defending a fortress that shouldn't have held, commanded by a general who shouldn't have won. 8,000 Persian dead. Modern historians estimate. And we should be clear this is estimation since Procopius provides no specific Byzantine casualty figures, perhaps 1,000 to 3,000 Byzantine losses. Sons, fathers, brothers, reduced to statistics in Procopius's chronicle. The price of tactical genius is always paid in blood. The Persian elite cavalry, forces historians identify as the legendary immortals who terrified armies from the Indus to the Euphrates, learned they could die like anyone else. The Byzantine infantry, who never struck a blow, watched from behind their trenches as geometry accomplished what courage alone couldn't. Dara bought time. 8 years of eternal peace that let Justinian dream of reconquest. 8 years that gave Belisarius the chance to take Carthage from the Vandals, Rome from the Goths, to push Byzantine borders back toward their ancient glory. 8 years purchased with one June day's tactical perfection. Not permanent victory. Time. Which, for empires teetering on collapse, might be more valuable than victory. But empires that buy time with gold tribute and genius generalship are empires already in decline. Within a century, both Byzantium and Persia would exhaust each other so completely that Arab armies carved through them like axes through rotten wood. Dara saved the moment. It couldn't save the trajectory. Sometimes tactical brilliance only delays the inevitable. Yet, here's what 1,500 years of history can't erase. On one impossible day, 25,000 men faced 50,000 and didn't just survive. They won. Won through preparation, through innovation, through a young commander who saw terrain as a weapon and geometry as artillery, who understood that if mathematics says you lose, you change the mathematics. Modern militaries study Dara because it proves a truth that every underdog needs to hear. Superior numbers guarantee nothing. Superior tactics, properly executed, can rewrite reality. The principles demonstrated: terrain as force multiplier, combined arms integration, interior lines doctrine, psychological operations, reserve timing. These appear in every military manual because they're timeless. Technology changes. Human nature and mathematical principles don't. The ruins of Dara still stand in southern Turkey, in Mardin province near the Syrian border. The walls partially preserved, the great cistern intact, the water gates visible. Tourists can visit, though few do. The battlefield itself is agricultural land. No monuments mark where Faris's Heruli struck from ambush. No plaques commemorate where 8,000 Persians died, learning that numbers aren't destiny. The trenches Belisarius designed have long since filled with earth and time. But somewhere in every military academy, in every tactical planning session, where a smaller force faces impossible odds, his ghost whispers the same lesson. Don't fight the battle your enemy expects. Build the battlefield where their strengths become irrelevant, and then stand there while they break themselves against geometry they didn't bother to understand. That's not just tactics. That's changing the rules of mathematics itself. That's what genius looks like when it refuses to accept defeat. 25 years old, 25,000 warriors, 50,000 enemies. And on one June day in 530, in a narrow valley whose name most people couldn't find on a map, Flavius Belisarius proved that sometimes the impossible is just mathematics, waiting for someone clever enough to rewrite the equation. The odds said he'd lose. The geography said otherwise. And 8,000 Persian corpses proved that when genius meets geometry, when preparation meets opportunity, when a young commander refuses to accept that superior numbers mean inevitable defeat, sometimes the impossible comes real. Sometimes mathematics doesn't matter. Sometimes genius does.